Merry Christmas, friends. To celebrate, I'm dropping 4 new merch designs to wrap yourself up in this holiday season. There's a ton of other designs to select from as well, making it the perfect gift to cozy up with this holiday. Grab a shirt, hat, mug, or hoodie over at shop.spreadshirt.com/letsread. Link down below. Thanks so much. "2008 was a hell of a year. It started all right at first, but then not only did Chelsea lose their first ever Champions League final, but September's financial crisis made a lot of people worry about their futures, myself included. You might remember the time. Yet all that paled in comparison with something much more personal, when a close personal friend of mine named Jane, not a real name, confessed her husband of 3 years had been abusing her. Now, we'd suspected something for a while because after that first year's honeymoon period with her new husband Nick, Jane started to act very differently. She lost all of her cheerfulness, and she was constantly busy but wouldn't explain why. And sometimes it felt like someone was just sucking the life out of her, just like a vampire or something. Well, as it turns out, someone was, metaphorically of course, and it was Nick. Now, he'd never hit her hard enough to bruise, but he did hit her. He'd also intimidated her, choked her, and once locked her in their attic for an entire day after an argument about his drinking. Nick told Jane that she deserved it, and that it was for her own good, and that if she ever told anyone what he did to her, he'd kill her. No ifs or buts, he'd just do it. Because he'd rather spend the rest of his life in prison than have her going around bad-mouthing him. Now, I was shocked, incredibly so, and I think my first major question was, what the hell happened to Nick for him to change so drastically? Now, when I first met him, he was an absolute gentleman, with nothing in the way of warning signs. But Jane said the change came after Nick's dad passed away, and that she strongly suspected his dad of doing all the same things to his mom when he was a kid. Nick went through a period of depression, and then when he came out of it, Jane said that he was just never the same. Now, that was late spring when she first told me, and it took months upon months of talking to lawyers and the police while hoping and praying. But by September, Jane managed to obtain a video recording of Nick's abuse, and upon showing it to the police, he was immediately arrested. His trial was set for the end of November, and thanks to the footage that Jane had provided, Nick had little choice but to plead guilty and hope for a very lenient sentence. Now, Jane was terrified that he'd only get a suspended one because she knew a restraining order wouldn't be enough to keep him away. But when it came to sentencing, we got the best news possible because the aggravated nature of the abuse meant that even though he had no criminal history, Nick got 5 years in prison. Jane seemed happy for a few days, but it didn't last. She might have gotten Nick out of her hair, but that didn't dispel all the pain and regret that she felt from having, and these were her words, wasted years of her life. Now, we could all see it. Jane needed some serious cheering up, so on the very last day of November, when I sent a group text out to a mutual friend group suggesting that we throw a Christmas party for her, everyone agreed. Now, we set the date for Saturday the 13th, and from the first of the month, I was planning and decorating almost non-stop. I bought a ton of finger foods, stocked up on about a dozen bottles of wine and spirits, and put together an awesome playlist for it too. And then after decking out my house with all types of wreaths, garlands, and bunting, we were ready to party. Now, there was just one rule. Don't mention anything about Jane's ex-husband. We wanted the party to be a place that she could decompress, and if possible, forget about her troubles for just a few short hours. Now, I've always found it ironic that Christmas is often a time when people's fears and anxieties bubble to the surface, especially problems within their families. So if we managed to put even the smallest smile on her face, it'd be worth the effort. So, on the night of the party, I reminded guests of the no Nick talk rule as they arrived. Now, I was terrified the wine might loosen their tongues, but they were as good as gold. Jane arrived to nothing but cheerful greetings and festive well-wishing. No talk of Nick, the divorce, or the fact that he was currently serving the first month of his 5-year sentence. Things started calmly at first, with a bit of buble and burgundy, but as more and more of our friends arrived and people started cracking open the spiced rum, we switched from Bing Crosby to Mariah Carey, All I Want for Christmas Is You, and things kicked off big time. We were singing and dancing, properly raising the roof, the kind of party that's only acceptable at Christmas time when the neighbors are too warm and cozy and probably drunk to complain. Now luckily, our neighbors had gone out for the evening, so we weren't bothering anyone, and more importantly, Jane was having the time of her life. It was the first time that I'd seen her laugh like that in what felt like years. Not just putting on a mask so she wouldn't upset the wanker of an ex-husband. I mean, truly having a laugh. And no one said a thing about Nick. Not until she did, because at one point she asked for everyone's attention and then declared a toast. Now I thought that she might make it to new beginnings or to good friends, but instead, Jane declared that we were drinking to that bastard behind bars. And so drink we did. Things kicked up a gear when I put on Gloria Gaynor's I Will Survive, and it honestly was making me emotional just thinking about it because I don't know if you've ever seen someone sing that song and really feel it, but good God, that was heavy. And the mood picked up when I put on some Rihanna, and then by the time Low by Flo Rida was pumping on the speakers, the spirits were at their highest. I remember having a cup of mulled wine someone made on the stove, and then myself, Jane, and a mutual friend of ours named Steph decided to put a full face of makeup on her boyfriend. We found it hilarious at the time, like so funny I actually peed myself a little bit, and I'm honestly wishing I was joking, but I can't laugh about it now, not after what came next. Now to get from my bedroom to the bathroom, Jane only had to walk a few feet across the hallway, but she also had to walk past a large window which overlooked our driveway and the street beyond. Now, I thought that she was taking a while in the toilet, but then again, she was so drunk and had so much that a tactical chunder wasn't out of the question, so I didn't think to check on her until maybe a few minutes after I should have. But wouldn't have mattered anyway because by then, it was too late. Seconds later, Jane came bursting through the bedroom door, looking pale and frightened, saying that she needed to leave. I barely got a word out before Jane started shouting, "He's outside. He's right there in the street. He's outside." I remember Steph asking, "Who's outside?" Because although now it all seems so obvious, at the time we genuinely had no idea who she was talking about. And then when Jane started saying how Nick was outside, it was like the saddest moment of thinking, oh God, the poor dear's a nervous wreck and she's having some kind of breakdown. Now, I remember Steph trying to hug her while saying, "Nick can't be outside, babe. He's in prison." But Jane practically shoved her away, saying, "I'll show you. He's right there in the street." She then dragged Steph out into the hallway by the hand, and then as I followed, she pointed out the window towards the street lamp just beyond our driveway. Now, I remember saying, "Jane, darling, there's no one there." To which she responded, "He was just there, just now. I swear to God he was." No one downstairs could hear what was going on thanks to the music, but Steph and her boyfriend joined us in the hallway to help me calm Jane down. Now, it sounds absolutely mental looking back on it, but I think we really did believe that she was suffering some kind of PTSD-related paranoid delusion. She'd had a lot to drink, and a few other things too, so of course she'd started overthinking, and going to the toilet on her own would have given her all the time that she needed to start spiraling into negative thoughts. As Jane started to have a full-on panic attack, Steph started telling her that she was going to look around outside to make sure that there was no one there. Now, I thought that might calm her down a bit, and evidently so did Steph, because all it did was cause Jane further agitation. Now, she kept saying, No, don't go out there. Don't let him get me." And by this time, people coming up the stairs to use the bathroom were noticing what was going on. Another friend of ours took over from Steph in trying to calm Jane down as Steph went downstairs to look outside. She later said that as she was walking to the front door, she started wondering why she was even bothering. Even if there had been someone standing out there in the street, it was literally impossible that it was Nick because that guy was locked up. But Steph opened the door all the same, and when she did, she said it was like seeing a ghost. Because standing in front of her, clear as day, was the one person it couldn't have been. It was Nick. Steph said that she tried to slam the door closed again, but Nick threw a foot in the door, and she started screaming for help, but there was maybe 15 women in the house and only 2 men. So even when 2 people did run to help Steph, Nick was able to just simply barge the door open and shove his way inside. I remember hearing the screams, and then all of a sudden there was this booming, "Where is she? I know she's here, now tell me where she is." Jane started screaming. No words this time, just these sort of fractured screams of terror as her worst nightmares suddenly came to life. Now, I was having a difficult time myself because I knew Nick's voice, so I knew that it was him down there. But that was impossible. He was supposed to be in prison for an absolute minimum of 5 years. Now, I thought he must have escaped, in which case he'd done so with a great deal of determination. And if his sole motivation was to hurt Jane, then we were in serious, serious trouble. Our house wasn't exactly massive, so to get from the front door to the stairs, Nick only had to barge his way through the cluster of small human shields before he had an unimpeded path. But just as he was making his way up the stairs, Steph's northern boyfriend, named Ryan, appeared with a cricket bat that he'd grabbed from my boyfriend's office and started swinging it as hard as he could while shouting, "Come on then, big man. Come and have a go at me then." Nick didn't hesitate and charged up the stairs at Ryan, who, as you remember, was still wearing a face full of makeup, and Jane ran into the bathroom screaming and locked the door. Now, Nick was a big fella, and no offense to him, but Ryan wasn't, so I could see why Jane thought that he had no chance of stopping him. Now, I suppose Nick didn't believe Ryan was capable of it either, or was so blind with rage that it didn't occur to him, but as he came up the stairs, he left himself wide open for Ryan to bring that cricket bat down vertically right on the top of Nick's head. And the sound that slab of wood made as it came in contact with Nick's skull is something I'll never, ever forget. I'll also never forget that horrible feeling of like bloodlust almost, and it frightens me to remember how happy I was that Ryan's swing made such effective contact. There was that horrible sort of muted thunk as the bat hit his head, and then Nick sort of grunted like the blow had done something to his brain, and it was really disturbing to hear, but again, I just thought good because it resulted in him stumbling back down the 2 or 3 stairs that he just climbed. So it was a double staircase, shaped in a sort of U, so like several steps, a flat turn, and then a couple more. So Nick didn't have far to stumble, and it meant that he didn't have far to come back either. Only that time, he knew what Ryan was capable of with that cricket bat, so the swings alone kept him at bay. Ryan wasn't alone anymore either. I remember someone coming out of a bedroom and throwing what turned out to be a ceramic wax burner at Nick as he stood there on the landing. Now, it was quite a hefty thing too, probably about the size of a person's head, and although it missed Nick and smashed uselessly on the wall behind him, it gave him a real fright. And literally everyone was screaming at him to get out, and Ryan was taking these wild swings at him as people were throwing stuff. But Nick had just seen Jane by this point, having run up into the bathroom screaming, and seeing her was like a red rag to a bull. So much so that he made a second attempt to climb those stairs that Ryan was defending. Ryan swung the cricket bat again, but Nick was ready for it, and held a forearm above his head to block the force. And to our absolute horror, he somehow withstood Ryan's full-force blow with the cricket bat and continued advancing up the stairs. He actually had a foot on the top stair when Ryan swung the bat a second time, but unlike the first block, Nick's arm clearly couldn't handle a second, and it gave way so that the cricket bat connected with his skull again, and that time, Nick full-on tumbled back down the short flight of stairs, flipping over so that when he landed, he was lying on his front. It looked like he was out cold for a second, but then he raised his face towards us. He was awake, but he was bleeding, and I could see a smear of it near his hairline as he got up on very wobbly legs. And that's when someone started shouting, "The police are on their way. Don't let him leave. They're only a few minutes away." And that flipped everything on its head. When we'd been screaming at him to leave, it was like Nick had gone completely berserk and couldn't hear us. But then the second he heard the words, "Don't let him leave," he decided that's exactly what he wanted to do. Now, I suppose hearing that part about the police sort of knocked some sense into him too, but yeah, he went back down the stairs again, and it was like the whole scene played itself out in reverse. Nick had to basically fight his way through a human wall of women to get out of the house, and while he did so with pretty much ease, he got a good clawing on his way out. And off he ran, into the night with a handful of drunk women trailing him on legs that were just as wobbly on their own. It was just absolute chaos. Our neighbors from across the street were coming out of their houses in their PJs and housecoats to see what all the bother was about. And then, seeing as multiple 999 calls been made, multiple police cars started turning up with their sirens blaring and their lights flashing. And I remember the first guy jumping back into his car once the girls explained what was happening. And then another car turned up minutes later, and 2 officers then started dealing with the girls after herding them back into the house. And it was only then that things started to calm down again, but obviously not for Jane. She didn't come out of that upstairs toilet until the policewoman knocked on the door and told her it was safe. And then, even when she did come out, she was absolutely hysterical. And the aftermath was horrible. There was a lot of crying while people were giving statements, and one of our friends got told off by another for offering the male officer a glass of wine, which is funny looking back on it, but at the time we were far too shaken up to find it amusing. But even then, the question on everyone's lips was this: how in the hell had Nick gotten out of prison when he was supposed to be in there for 5 years? We didn't find out for another week and a half, but before then, someone's shot in the dark had apparently hit the mark. I remember Steph texting me one night asking, "You don't think they let Nick out of prison by accident, do you?" Now, I said no instantly because that didn't seem possible. And I mean, I could see someone being released a week or 2 early at the end of their sentence, perhaps due to some sort of error in the system or good behavior, but not someone who had only just arrived there a few days prior. Now, the staff would have had to have been brain dead, actually brain dead, to let that sort of thing happen, and while I'm sure the prison service has a few numpties hanging around, they can't possibly be that dense, can they? And so that was my stance on it. Nick had broken out of prison somehow, and no other explanation fit. Except there was another explanation, and it was the very same one that I'd refused to believe. Thanks to a freak clerical error, Nick had been marked for permanent, unsupervised release by Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service. Not one single person thought it was unusual that a violently abusive man who'd recently begun a 5-year prison sentence was being marked for early release. Nick must have thought Christmas had come early when they came into his cell that day and told him to report to wherever you go to be released from prison, and all that stuff he came in with was returned to him, including his phone, and then through a little bit of Facebook wizardry, he found the group that we'd made for the Christmas party, which is how he found us. He was arrested a few days later following a brief manhunt, and he was then returned to prison, where he ended up doing 3 years of his 5-year sentence before being released on license. And that meant that if he made any contact with Jane or any of us, he'd go straight back to jail for the remaining 2 years. Jane said that she'd been in touch with a liaison officer who went through all the reasons that Nick had been deemed fit for release after 3 years instead of the full 5. They'd already paid her a hefty out-of-court settlement, but Nick being released on the day of that party was still treated as a really big deal, as it should have been. And the officer explained how Nick had been through all of his rehabilitation stuff in prison, anger management sessions, and stuff like that, and apparently he'd shown some really positive improvements over the years. We didn't believe any of it at first, so Jane and her boyfriend were really frightened of Nick showing up on their doorstep, but the prison service wasn't lying, and we later heard that he was moving elsewhere to start fresh. Now, I'm not sure where he ended up, and frankly, I don't care. But he certainly didn't breach the terms of his license, and as far as I know, he's been nowhere near Jane or any of us. Now, thank God for small mercies, I suppose, and Jane later told me that she'd sort of mentally forgiven the prison service for their massive mess-up. To me, that shows an incredible kind of grace from her, because if that was me in her position, I'm not sure that I'd be so forgiving over what amounted to a major cock-up of biblical proportions. I didn't know her as well as I'd like, but by all accounts, my grandmother was a real character. She grew up in Montgomery County, just a few miles outside of a town named Mount Ida, and then after she married my grandfather, they moved into town to a little house at the end of the lane. Now, she gave birth to my dad about a year later, and Grandpa supported them by working in a nearby sawmill. It was a simple life, but it was a good one, and my dad can attest to them both being really good parents. But every so often he'd tell me a story about his mom or dad that reminds me just how rural Arkansas they really were, and this is one of them. So back during Christmas of 1961, my grandma was having a really busy day. She had to do a bunch of laundry, cook dinner for her sick mom, drop my dad off at the Santa's Grotto event in the fields outside of town, and then go buy some presents for her nieces and nephews. All before picking Dad up again from the grotto, delivering her mom's dinner, and then coming back home again and make another meal for her own family to enjoy that evening. My dad said that he was really excited about the Santa's Grotto thing, and Grandma was only too happy to drive him over to it since the event was staffed by local volunteers who took care of the kids. And that meant that local parents got a few precious hours to themselves at one of the busiest times of the year, so as you can imagine, it was a very popular place with the adults too. But it wasn't just a place to dump your kids off for a few hours so you could wrap and hide their Christmas presents. Dad said that the grotto was awesome. There were songs, gifts, and games, all inside this beautifully decorated tent that felt like a winter wonderland right there in the middle of Arkansas. And then last but not least, before your mom and dad came to pick you up, you got to meet Santa, who gave you a little bag of candy and your very own toy. Dad said that he remembered being excited about it all morning. Grandma said that she remembered him bugging her while she was doing her laundry and then prepping her mom's evening meal. And then finally, after drawing up a list of which presents to buy each of my several aunts and uncles, Grandma announced that it was time to drive my dad to the grotto. He said he was raring to go, so he hopped in their truck, and maybe 10 minutes later, they're walking up to the big old revival-style tent on the edge of town that served as the grotto. Now, the year before, all the folks taking care of the kids were either lined up outside to greet the parents or inside taking care of the kids that were already there. But that year, there was no one outside at all, and it was only when Grandma got closer that a really badly dressed Santa Claus emerged from the tent to greet them. Grandma asked the guy where everyone else was, which prompted the badly dressed Santa to lift the flap of the tent and direct Grandma's attention to a single badly dressed elf standing near 24 kids. Again, Grandma asked where the heck everyone else was, but Santa assures her that they're just simply running a little late and that they'll be on the road in no time. Grandma said that she tried not to be too unimpressed with their lack of organization because she understood the busy nature of the season. And then, as much as the whole scene looked kind of off, the elf seemed like he was doing a good job keeping the kids entertained, so Grandma didn't pay it much mind. Now, my dad had been looking forward to it for days, and he raved about it after the previous year's showing. So while Grandma felt comfortable enough to drive back home again, she still couldn't shake the feeling that something was a little different about the grotto that year. Santa Claus looked a heck of a lot younger than he did the previous year, and this one had the most weird feature about him. He had heterochromia, or differently colored eyes, as you might know. One bright blue one and one dark brown one. Now, getting back to her busy day, Grandma gets back into her truck, drives the short distance back home, and then goes on working on my great-grandmother's dinner, who was under the weather and too sick to make it for herself. Now, Grandma's balancing browning the meat, chopping garlic, and boiling vegetables, but all the while, she's listening to her wireless radio set. Now, Grandma used to adore that radio, and she listened to just about any time she was in the kitchen. Now, it didn't matter if it was the news, music, or talk shows, Grandma would listen all the same. And so there she was, cooking her mama's dinner when the radio DJ started talking in between songs. It was a news bulletin, and it was a serious one too. The DJ explained how there were 2 wanted criminals passing through Montgomery County, having robbed a bank in the city of Hot Springs the previous day. In the execution of this crime, the 2 criminals were said to have murdered 5 people, one of whom was a child. And as you can imagine, hearing this immediately got Grandma's attention, but as she listened, She went from harboring a cursory concern to feeling her blood turn directly to ice. The DJ went on to read out a description of the criminals, one given to him by the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department. One of them was shorter and skinnier with plain features, while the other had something much more distinctive about his appearance, that of heterochromia, or two differently colored eyes. Grandma said that she just about dropped what she was doing, turned off the stove and oven, and then set about frantically putting together a tray of food. She threw half-eaten pie on there, a few slices of bread and pieces of fruit, and then finished it off with a few handfuls of little candies that she kept in her pantry. She then grabbed the tray, ran out to her truck, and then zoomed off back towards Santa's grotto. But not before making a quick stop in her bedroom, where she took something out of my grandpa's nightstand. She arrived at the grotto about 15 minutes later, zooming down the track towards the big old tent standing there in the field. She then got out of the truck, grabbed the tray of food from the passenger seat, and then started walking towards the tent while calling out, "Oh, Santa! Mr. Elf! I got the kids something to eat." She yells that out a couple more times, then out comes Santa and his elf looking confused as hell. Grandma stops about 10 yards from them, and then starts explaining how she and one of the grotto's organizers had arranged for her to stop by to bring the kids a bite to eat. Now Santa and the elf give each other another look of confusion, and then Santa responds, "Oh, sure, thanks. The kids would sure appreciate a snack right about now." They step aside from the tent flap and gesture for her to look inside, but Grandma doesn't budge. Instead, she gives Santa a big dumb look and asks him, "Well, aren't you going to take this tray?" Santa shoots his elf another look, who shrugs, and then Santa starts walking towards Grandma to take the tray of food from her. But the second Santa puts both hands on that tray and took a step back from my grandma, she pulled out my grandpa's .45 and pointed it right in Santa's face. She didn't talk to him, not at first. Instead, she told Santa's elf not to move a goddamned muscle unless he wanted to see his buddy's brains blown out in front of him. She told them she knew who they were, and that while they might have fooled her the first time around, it wasn't about to happen a second. She might have been putting on a bold face, but Grandma later said that she was terrified. She didn't actually know how to use that .45, and she could only make it look like she did. So when she heard the sound of a second truck zooming up the track and realized the father of another child in that tent had been listening to the radio, she felt relief like never before. The other man had the presence of mind to call the county sheriff, so a car full of deputies was just a few minutes behind him. Grandma and the man had the two criminals laying down in the dirt, and by then, the kids were all gathered outside the tent. Some of them were really upset at the sight of Santa Claus and his elf laying down at gunpoint, and they wailed up a storm as the deputies put them in cuffs and led them to their car. My dad said he actually hated her before she explained what happened, and that he'd never been so embarrassed in all of his life watching his mama holding Santa Claus, of all people, at gunpoint. And it was only later that he realized what a hero she'd been, and how there was a good chance that she'd saved not only his life, but the lives of most of Montgomery County's children. The sheriff later said that there was a very high chance that those two criminals were planning on holding the county's children hostage, and with them already having killed a child over in Hot Springs, there was a chance that they'd kill even more kids to show that they were serious. Grandma ended up being my dad's hero, but also the hero of the whole damned county, and she ended up leading the town parade during the 4th of July parade of 1962. She had a ton of crazy stories like that, but unfortunately, I didn't get to hear even half of them with her own lips, as Grandma passed away when I was still in my teens. I wasn't able to get to know her a lot, but boy do I miss her. And I feel lucky that I got to spend the time that I did with her, but sometimes I feel like she's still around, in a manner of speaking. I see her spirit in me and my sister, and I see some of it in my own daughter too, because although we don't live the same way she did, there's still that streak of rural Arkansas wild that'll always be in our blood. When I was just 4 years old, I saw Santa Claus. I remember waking up in the middle of the night on Christmas Eve and creeping around my parents' apartment as I tried to catch a glimpse of him in the act. And so there I was, tiptoeing around when I suddenly heard a noise coming from outside the window where the fire escape was. I remember being kind of scared as I peeled back the curtain, but then, there he was. Red clothes, big black boots, and that big old beard framing a wide, friendly smile. I was stunned, totally dumbstruck, standing there with what was probably this wide-eyed look on my face. Santa froze on the spot, obviously embarrassed that he'd been discovered by a kid, but then all he did was smile and wave at me. And then after I waved back, he raised a single finger to his lips and made a shh sound. I thought it was the coolest thing ever, and you can bet your ass that I tried to keep my mouth shut since it was on Santa's orders. But after he crept down the fire escape and out of sight, I don't think even a minute passed before I ran into my mom and dad's room and announced that I'd just seen Santa. Now, they obviously responded saying, "Sure you did, buddy. Now go back to sleep." But I couldn't. I think I just laid there all night before I finally just couldn't take it anymore and rushed downstairs to see if Santa had left my presents under the tree. I knew that he must have if I'd seen him on the fire exit, and I was right because there they were, all wrapped up with bows on them. And to me, it was the best Christmas ever. I got a brand new set of Legos from my parents, and then when my grandparents showed up, they brought me this sort of pop-up book on dinosaurs, which I was completely obsessed with at the time. We all ate dinner after exchanging gifts and then fell asleep in front of the TV before my dad carried me to my bedroom. The next day meant more visitors, and more visitors meant more presents for yours truly. And so once again, I'm on top of the world getting all kinds of toys and candy from my mom and dad's friends. Now, we got so many visitors that even the police stopped by. They didn't bring any presents for me, but I remember thinking it was nice that they stopped by all the same. But then, as most of you probably figured, and I myself figured out years later, those cops didn't stop by just to wish us a Merry Christmas. Years later, at the very end of elementary school, a rumor went around that shook even the 5th graders to their cores. Someone was claiming that jolly old Saint Nick, who we all accepted as the magical deliverer of gifts, was actually fake. He actually didn't deliver billions of gifts to children worldwide in the space of a single night, and not just because Rudolph, with his nose so bright, couldn't guide the sleigh tonight. It was because it was all just made up. And we all thought it was just baloney at first because, why would someone make all of that up? Especially if it was our parents doing all that gift shopping and gift wrapping and gift hiding till they could be planted under the tree. They'd want the credit if it was all their handiwork, right? Well, not according to Kathy Newman in the 4th grade, who'd said that she'd found the dollhouse that she'd mentioned in her letter to Santa hidden in her parents' garage. She said she posted that letter her very own self and that not a single other soul had seen it. But if that were the case, how did her parents know which dollhouse to buy? Now, looking back on it, Kathy probably told her mom which dollhouse that she was going to request from Santa, and that's how she knew which one to buy. Kids are stupid like that, I guess. But Kathy wasn't the only one who had stories like that. I remember getting the bus home from school and then asking my parents if it was true and that Santa was all fake and stuff. Now, Mom very cleverly told me that some kids, as they get older, choose not to believe in Santa anymore. But since Santa only visits kids who choose to believe in him, that's when a kid's parents have to step in to fill the gap. I guess she didn't want to be the one to burst my bubble, but then I hit her with what was really bothering me. Because if Santa wasn't real, then who was the guy I'd seen climbing down our fire escape that night? Now I remember her saying, "Huh? Who was climbing down the fire escape?" And I couldn't believe that she didn't remember it for a second, but when she explained that she'd been half asleep when I ran into her bedroom to wake her up, I told her the story all over again. The guy in the red clothes, his big beard and the smile behind it, and then the way he shushed me before he sort of just went off down that fire exit. I remember Mom looking all kinds of shocked for a moment, before my dad stepped in to save her by saying something like, "Sounds an awful lot like Santa to me, son," or at least someone dressed like him. Someone dressed like him. Now that made sense. I was starting to really doubt the whole Santa thing because a lot of what the kids said at school made a lot of sense. But then a guy dressed like Santa on Christmas Eve, that seemed like the most normal thing in the world. Now anyways, more than 10 years passed and I'm living on my own, but I've driven back to Mom and Dad's to spend Christmas with them and my little brother. It was December 23rd, so almost Christmas Eve, and after a late dinner, we stayed up drinking a little wine together. We worked our way through one bottle, and my little brother was even allowed to have a glass if he agreed to go to bed immediately afterwards. And not long after, Mom called it a night, so it was just me and Dad polishing off that second bottle together, reminiscing about the Christmases past. Now, eventually I brought up that whole Santa sighting that happened when I was 4. Obviously not to claim that I'd actually seen him, but how it amused me that I was so very deeply believing that I had, even though it was just a dude in a Santa costume. And I thought Dad might laugh, or at the minimum crack a smile. But he didn't. He just kind of sighed before he took a big gulp of that wine in his glass. And I knew some kind of explanation was coming, and I figured that it was going to be a bad one. And then when it came, it was just as bad as I thought. So, remember when I told you about the cops paying us a visit on the day after Christmas? Well, they were there to ask my mom and dad a few questions about a murder that had happened just a few floors above them. They didn't tell my parents this at the time, but it turned out to be some pimp who beat the snot out of one of his girls. He beat her so bad that she ended up in the hospital, and it was her brother that got notified. So after heading over to the hospital to talk to her sister about who did it and why, he went straight over to the guy's apartment in our old apartment building and stabbed him to death. Apparently that girl's brother stabbed her pimp exactly 112 times. I mean, think about that. Think about stabbing a person just 10 times. That's a lot of stabbing, right? Now times it by 11 and change, and to do that you'd literally have to be going berserk, like zero self-control, or hate a person so bad you just temporarily lose your mind. But I guess if I had a little sister, and someone got her hooked on drugs, pimped her out, and then sent her to the hospital, I'd be very tempted to turn them into a human pincushion too. The guy sneaking down our fire escape wasn't dressed in red clothing. He'd been wearing a white t-shirt that had been soaked in that pimp's blood. And just about the only part that had not was right up near his neck where there was a flash of white trim, and I guess in my tired 4-year-old brain, that made it look exactly like a Santa Claus costume. Mom and Dad didn't take me seriously when I reported what I saw, and nor did anyone that remembered it when the cops came to visit that day after Christmas. They only realized what I'd actually seen once I was in 5th grade, and I came home with all kinds of questions about Santa being fake. If you remember, it was my dad who got in there with the save, so I didn't look into it and find out that I'd seen a murderer covered in blood that night. And if I had, who knows what kind of effect that would have had on me. I guess that's why our parents tell us those little white lies. It's not just to make us believe there's magic in the world, it's to protect us from all the darkness that exists alongside it. So my mom is French and of Congolese descent, but she moved to Montreal when she was in her 20s. That's where she met my dad, but she used to live in Marseille, which is this big port city in the southern coast of France. It's a really beautiful place and literally thousands of years old, so there's this crazy mishmash of old and new architecture that you can only really describe as Mediterranean. And then seeing as it's a straight shot from there to Africa if you sail directly south, the place is a real melting pot, as they say. There are the Algerians, the Senegalese, the Cameroonians, and of course, the Congolese, like my mother. And although they don't strictly live side by side, there is a lot of mixing between groups as well as the native French. People enjoy each other's food, they socialize with each other, different cultures, but one people. But that's either downtown or way out in the suburbs because, as my mom told me, there are places in the inner cities that aren't nearly so wonderful, and she grew up in one of them. Mom said she grew up in one of 3 large apartment blocks in a place called La Castellane, which, for those of you who follow soccer, is where a guy called Zidane grew up. I don't know soccer, but I hear that's a big deal. Anyways, these were really rough places. Like these days, French kids literally just call it le ghetto, and rappers call themselves stuff like ghetto phenom, which probably doesn't need any translating. So yeah, that's where Mom grew up, and if you'll excuse the cliche, what they lacked in wealth, they made up for in spirit. People took care of their neighborhoods, doing whatever they could to keep each other going. And a prime example of that would be what Mom and her neighbors tried to do for a lady named Madame Bissaka. And so Mom was in her teens when this all happened, so either the late 70s or early 80s, but a few years before that, Madame Bissaka's family experienced a terrible tragedy. In the final year of his high education and said to be the first of their family to attend university, the Bissaka's son suddenly and inexplicably disappeared. There were pleas for the boy to come home, and missing posters were posted on walls all up and down the area, but Madame Bissaka's son was never seen again. Poor Madame Bissaka painted her boy as an angel, saying that he was pure-hearted and innocent and would never do anything to get himself into trouble. But according to my mom, that wasn't entirely true, and everyone knew it. You see, Marseille isn't just some cutesy little port city. It's a major dock for international trade, and wherever big containers are passing through ports, dollars to donuts, people were smuggling stuff in those containers. Sometimes it's weapons, sometimes it's people, but most of the time, it's drugs. So seeing as Marseille was like the landing zone for all these narcotics, there was, and still is, a huge drug trade in the city. Cocaine hit Marseille in the same way that it hit Miami, because not all of that stuff was flying into America on planes. Tons of the stuff was going to Europe, so Marseille got just as violent as Miami did during that same period. But by the time my mom was a teenager, each and every one of Marseille's gangs were financing themselves by selling these drugs. But that brought all the territorial violence it does everywhere else, and that meant every so often, a boy like Madame Bissaka's son, who was known to be involved in gangs, would just disappear. And I guess no one had the heart to tell her, but she and her husband eventually found out, and when they did, they say it killed him. I don't believe in that old died of a broken heart thing, but I do believe that Monsieur Bissaka simply couldn't handle the stress of thinking his son had been murdered and disappeared. As knowing the way the gangs operated, his son would have been put through hell on earth before his killers finished the job. He ended up having a heart attack aged 50-something and dying long before his time was truly up, and this left poor Madame Bissaka all alone. It was just her in the apartment on the top floor of the building, with no one to keep her company after the sun went down, or when the rain drove everyone indoors. Whenever anyone saw her, they could see that the life was drained out of her, and that she was a woman simply waiting to die. And so, people decided to do something about it. Congolese people celebrate Christmas in a very traditional way. There's no Santa Claus, we don't really go for the whole winter wonderland thing, and it's not uncommon to give someone a home-cooked meal as a gift. We do like giving clothes, so all the dads get socks and underwear just like everyone else, and we also like singing Christmas songs too, just not the traditional carols that you might hear elsewhere. So as a Christmas gift to Madame Bissaka, many of her friends and neighbors decided to visit her apartment on Christmas Eve to bring her gifts and to sing for her. It took weeks of planning and secrecy, but then finally, on Christmas Eve, around 30 to 40 of Madame Bissaka's friends and neighbors lined up the walkway outside of her front door and broke into a song as they put down beautifully wrapped gifts outside her home. There were a lot of food parcels and a lot of clothing, but some people brought gift-wrap boxes wrapped in bows, too. It wasn't just the singers who brought along gifts either. People from all over the apartment block showed up to make that Christmas a very special one for her. Mom said people she didn't even recognize were lined up with gifts. As Madame Bissaka came out of her apartment, she burst into tears at what she saw. They were happy tears, not sad ones, and people ended up partying with her until the midnight hours. It was a very happy occasion, and the residents of Mom's apartment block were understandably very pleased with themselves. But it wasn't to last. As after drinking and dancing with Madame Basaka until after midnight, the apartment block's residents retired to their beds for the night, and they did so in the knowledge that they'd shone a little light into the life of their neediest neighbors, but that light only lasted until dawn. The sheer volume of gifts Madame Basaka had been given meant that she couldn't possibly open them all in one night, and it's also considered bad manners to open someone's gift right there in front of them, so for the most part, Madame didn't unwrap the vast majority of her gifts until early the next morning. But when she did, everyone knew about it because the entire apartment block was awoken just after first light by Madame Basaka's screams. Mom said that they were so ear-splitting when they woke her up that she went tumbling out of bed thinking that there was a fire. And then the next thing she knew, her mom was rushing up the top floor with several other residents to see what was happening. No one knew it was Madame Basaka just yet. All they knew was that someone was screaming. But once she reached the top floor in the Madame's apartment, they realized what was happening. She was kneeling on the walkway just outside her apartment, and she was so upset by something that it was like she'd lost her mind. Mom said as soon as she saw her neighbors coming to help, she leapt to her feet and began yelling at them to keep away. She yelled, "Baboni, Baboni" at them, which means murderers in the Congolese Lingala language, and Mom said that she was so hysterical that they couldn't calm her down. In fact, Madame Basaka was so hysterical that it took a good minute before Mom noticed that she was holding something in her hand. It was a skull, a human skull, but Madame Basaka cradled it like it was the most precious thing in the world, and in hindsight, I guess it was. The cops were called, as folks were so scared for the woman's state of mind that they feared that she might throw herself from her own balcony. They managed to calm her down a little, maybe even by threat of arrest, but when she'd mellowed a little, she told the cops why she'd gone so crazy that morning, and as you probably guessed already, it all involved that human skull that she held in her hand when my mom went to help her. Madame Basaka said that after waking up early, she worked her way through almost every gift she'd been given until she reached one particular cube-shaped package. She unwrapped it, took off the lid, and recoiled when she saw the skull that sat inside. She was quite naturally horrified, but she didn't start screaming right away. That didn't come until she saw the small, handwritten note which lay underneath the hunk of bone and teeth, which read, in her native language or translated to English, saying, "A present from your son." Mom later found out through the usual apartment complex grapevine that it was most likely Algerian gangsters that had abducted and murdered the Basaka boy, as they sometimes kept their heads of their victims in freezer units so they could later use them to taunt their enemies. Yet she also heard it was just as possible that the Senegalese gangs, or maybe even rival Congolese gangs, had mimicked the Algerian signature horror in order to throw the investigators off their scent. Either way, whoever killed Madame Basaka's son had learned of her neighbor's attempts to console her and decided that wasn't going to happen. But that also meant that the boy's killers had somehow convinced a resident of the apartment complex to deliver the package themselves. This was fairly encouraging at first, as all the police had to do was figure out who delivered it, but no one would admit it. They then tried dusting the box the skull came in for fingerprints, but found none at all, not even those belonging to someone from the apartment complex. Mom says that that was the day she decided she was going to leave, and although she wasn't in a position to for another few years, she moved to Canada at the first available opportunity. She does miss Marseille, especially the food, but she says it was worth it giving it up to live in a safe place, even if that place is a long, long way from home. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul, all links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember,
we ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days.